Chapter 10. The Practice of the Art of Being. The art of being is the skill to remain firmly established in the actionless and therefore thought-free state of perfectly clear self-conscious being. It is the state of absolute self-surrender and true self-knowledge. Like any other skill, the art of being is cultivated and perfected by practice. The more we practice, the more we will develop the strength that we require to remain steadily poised in our natural thought-free consciousness of our own essential being. How much practice each one of us will actually require in order to perfect our skill in this art of being will depend upon the relative degree of our present maturity or ripeness of mind. In the case of Sri Ramana, only a moment of practice was required, because at that time his mind was already perfectly ripe and therefore willing to surrender itself and be consumed in the effulgent light of infinitely clear self-consciousness. However, most of us do not possess even a fraction of such ripeness, so we require long and persistent practice of this art of being in order to develop it. What do we mean when we speak of ripeness or maturity of mind? Our mind will be spiritually ripe when it has been purified or cleansed of all its desires, all its likes and dislikes, its attachments, its aversions, its fears, and so on. And when it has thereby developed the willingness and true love to surrender itself entirely and thus subside peacefully in its own essential self-conscious being or emness, our desires are the obstacles that make us unwilling to surrender ourselves to our infinite being, and therefore they are the cause and the form of our unripeness for self-knowledge. How can we develop the spiritual ripeness that we require in order to be able to surrender ourselves entirely in the state of absolute being? Though there are many means by which we can indirectly and gradually begin to cultivate such ripeness, ultimately we can perfect it only by practicing the art of being. All the other countless forms of spiritual practice, such as selfless service, dualistic devotion, realistic worship, repetition of a name of God, prayer, meditation, various forms of internal and external self-restraint, including the important virtues of ahimsa, or non-harming, that is, the compassionate avoidance of causing any form of harm or suffering to any living being, and the eightfold limbs of yoga, and so on, are indirect means which can enable us gradually to purify our mind, cleansing it of the grosser forms of its desires and thereby ripening it, but only to a certain extent. That is, since all spiritual practices other than the art of being involve an extroversion of our mind, a turning of our attention away from ourself towards something else, they can enable us to free ourselves effectively only from the grosser forms of our desires and attachments, but not from the more subtle forms, until and unless we begin to practice the art of being, keeping our attention fixed firmly and exclusively upon our own essential being as our own essential being. We cannot gain the inward clarity and focus that is required to detect and prevent the rising of our mind and its desires at their very starting point. How are we thus able to detect and prevent the rising of our mind by practicing the art of being? When we practice this art, our attention is fixed upon our essential self-conscious being, which is the source from which our mind arises along with all its most subtle desires, and so long as our attention thus remains vigilantly and firmly fixed on, in, and as its source, our mind will be unable to rise. However, whenever due to even the slightest slackening of our vigilant self-attentiveness, we allow our attention to waver and be diverted by any thought, we will thereby rise in the form of our thinking mind. But by repeatedly practicing this art of self-attentive being, we will gain the skill to detect any such slackening in our vigilant self-attentiveness at the very moment that it occurs. And thus we will be able to regain our self-attentiveness instantly and thereby prevent the rising of our mind at the very moment that it occurs. The more we practice this art of being, the more keen and sharp our clear self-attentiveness will become, and thereby our skill in the art of crushing the rising of our mind in its very source will steadily increase. Every moment that we succeed in thus vigilantly preventing even the least rising of our mind, the desires that impel it to rise will be steadily weakened, and our love to remain peacefully in our natural state of just being will be proportionately strengthened until finally it will totally overpower all our remaining and much weakened desires, thereby enabling us to surrender ourselves entirely in the infinite clarity of true self-knowledge. Other than this practice of keenly vigilant self-attentive being, there is no adequate means by which we can weaken and destroy all of our desires, including even our most subtle and therefore most powerful ones. All other spiritual practices involve some sort of activity of our mind, and so long as our mind is active, it will effectively be guarding and protecting all its innermost desires, including its fundamental desire to exist as a separate individual consciousness. By engaging our mind in any activity, we cannot destroy its basic desire for self-preservation, and so long as it retains this basic desire, it will continue to support and nourish it by cultivating other desires. That is, our mind's desire for self-preservation, which is satisfied and supported by all forms of spiritual practice other than the totally self-denying art of vigilantly self-attentive being, cannot stand on its own, but must be accompanied by some desire or other for something other than itself. This need is satisfied by every other form of spiritual practice, because all such practices provide our mind with something other than itself to attend to. In fact, they force our mind to attend to something other than itself. Therefore, no such practice can train our mind to relinquish all of its desires, particularly its desire to preserve its own separate existence. Some other spiritual practices do force our mind to subside, but such subsidence is only temporary because it is not accompanied by clear self-attentiveness. Therefore, in the 8th paragraph of Nanyar, Sri Ramana says, to make the mind subside permanently, there are no adequate means other than vichara, investigation, that is, the art of self-attentive being. If restrained by other means, the mind will remain as if subsided, but will emerge again. Even by pranayama, breath restraint, the mind will subside, however, though the mind remains subsided so long as the breath remains subsided. When the breath emerges or becomes manifest, it will also emerge and wander under the sway of its own vasanas, inclinations, impulses, or desires. The birthplace both of the mind and of the prana, the breath or life force, is one. Thought alone is the svarupa, the own form of the mind. The thought I alone is the first or basic thought of the mind. It alone is the ego. From where the ego arises, from there alone the breath also arises. Therefore, when the mind subsides, the prana also subsides. And when the prana subsides, the mind also subsides. However, in sleep, even though the mind has subsided, the breath does not subside. It is arranged thus by the ordinance of God for the purpose of protecting the body, and so that other people do not wonder whether the body has died. When the mind subsides in waking and in samadhi, any of the various types of mental absorption that result from yogic or other forms of spiritual practice, the prana subsides. The prana is said to be the gross form of the mind. Until the time of death, the mind keeps the prana in the body. And at the moment the body dies, the mind, grabs and takes it, the prana, away. Therefore, pranayama is just an aid to restrain the mind, but will not bring about manonasa, the annihilation of the mind. Before going on to discuss the efficacy of other forms of spiritual practice, Sri Ramana begins this paragraph by stating the important truth that to make the mind subside permanently, there are no adequate means other than vichara, investigation. Why is this so? Since the state of true self-knowledge, which is the only state in which the mind will remain permanently subsided, is a state of just being, it cannot be brought about by any action or doing, but only by the practice of being. Since vichara, or investigation, which is simply the practice of self-attentiveness, does not involve any action but is just a state of self-conscious being, and since every other form of spiritual practice is an action of one kind or another, vichara is the only practice that will enable us to abide in the state of eternal, infinite, and absolute being, which is the state of true self-knowledge. This same truth is also clearly stated by Sri Adi Shankara in verse 11 of Vivekachudamani. Action, karma, which generally means action of any kind whatsoever, but which in this context means specifically any action that is performed for spiritual benefit, is prescribed only for achieving chittasuddhi, purification of mind, and not for attaining vastu upalabdhi, direct knowledge or experience of reality, the true substance or essence which is absolute being. The attainment of this experience of the reality can be achieved only by vichara, and not at all by even 10 million actions. That is, except vastu vichara, investigation or scrutiny of our essential being or reality, all spiritual practices are actions, and as such they can only serve to purify our mind, and thereby make it fit to subside and remain permanently in our own essential being or vastu. However, though they can purify our mind to a certain extent, they cannot by themselves enable us to experience our own true being as it really is. In order to experience an absolute clear knowledge of our being, we must give up all actions or doings, and must cultivate perfectly pure love for just being, which we can do only by vichara, the practice of self-attentive being. Therefore, when discussing the efficacy of other forms of spiritual practice in the 8th and 9th paragraphs of Nanyar, Sri Ramana repeatedly emphasizes that they are all only aids that can prepare us for the practice of vichara, or self-attentive being, but that by themselves they cannot bring about manunasa, the complete annihilation of mind, which is the state of true self-knowledge or absolute self-conscious being. Because the aim of Sri Ramana in the 8th paragraph is to explain the limited value of pranayama or breath restraint, which is one of the central practices of yoga, he explains the principle that underlies pranayama in terms of the yoga philosophy. It is therefore only from the standpoint of the yoga philosophy that he says that the breath does not subside in sleep, that God has arranged it thus in order to protect the body, and that the mind takes away the prana at the time of death. However, from the viewpoint of his principal teachings, we should understand that all this is only relatively true, and is based upon the false belief cherished by most of us that the body and world exist independent of our mind. According to the truth revealed and explained by him on countless occasions, our body and the world exist only in the imagination of our own mind, like the body and the world that we experience in a dream, and hence when our mind subsides in sleep or in death, not only does our breath or life force subside and vanish along with it, but even our body ceases to exist. The central import of this paragraph is the truth that is stated in the first two sentences. Our mind will subside permanently only by remaining firmly fixed in the state of self-attentive being, because only in that state will the truth be revealed that our mind is truly ever non-existent. If instead of practicing the art of thus remaining fixed in the state of self-attentive being, we try to make our mind subside by pranayama or any other means, it will remain as if subsided for a short while, as it does in sleep, but will again rise and wander under the sway of its deeply ingrained impulsions or desires, which are not weakened in the least by such inattentive subsidence, any more than they are weakened in sleep. Like pranayama, all other forms of spiritual practice, except the art of self-attentive being, are merely aids which enable us to restrain our mind temporarily, but which cannot by themselves enable us to destroy it. We can effectively destroy our mind only by remaining in our natural state of perfectly clear, self-attentive being, and by no other means whatsoever. This truth, which was explicitly stated by Sri Ramana in the first two sentences of the 8th paragraph of Nanyar, is further emphasized by him with some more examples in the 9th paragraph. Just like pranayama, murti dhyana, meditation upon a form of God, mantra japa, repetition of sacred words such as a name of God, and ahara niyama, restriction of diet, particularly the restriction of consuming only vegetarian food, are just aids that restrain the mind, but will not bring about its annihilation. By both murti dhyana and mantra japa, the mind gains one-pointedness or concentration, just as if someone gives a chain in the trunk of an elephant, which is always moving, swinging about, trying to catch hold of something or other. That elephant will proceed holding it fast without grabbing and holding fast anything else. So indeed the mind, which is always moving, wandering about thinking of something or other, will, if trained in the practice of thinking of any one particular name or form of God, remain holding it fast, without thinking unnecessary thoughts about anything else. Because the mind spreads out, scattering its energy, as innumerable thoughts, each thought becomes extremely weak. For the mind which has gained one-pointedness when thoughts shrink and shrink, that is, which has gained one-pointedness due to the progressive reduction of its thoughts, and which has thereby gained strength, atma-vichara, self-investigation, which is the art of self-attentive being, will be easily accomplished by mita sattvika ahara niyama, the restraint of consuming only a moderate quantity of pure sattvika food, which is the best among all restrictions. The sattva guna, the quality of calmness, clarity, or beingness of mind, will increase, and thereby help will arise for self-investigation. Both murti dhyana and mantra japa are practices in the path of dualistic devotion, and hence they are efficacious to the extent to which they are practiced with genuine love for God. If we try to practice either of them without true love, our mind will constantly wander towards other thoughts because of the strength of its desire for whatever it happens to think about, and hence we will be unable to concentrate it entirely upon any single name or form of God. Therefore, when Sri Ramana says that by practicing either murti dhyana or mantra japa, our mind will gain one-pointedness, the meaning he implies is that our love for God will become focused and one-pointed, by thus concentrating our love and attention upon any one particular name or form of God. Our desire to think other thoughts will be weakened, and our love to think of God will thereby gain strength. Once our mind has gained this strength of one-pointed love for God, it will be able to practice the art of self-attentive being easily. Since our love for God cannot be complete until we surrender ourselves entirely to Him, any devotee who sincerely tries to think of God constantly will naturally develop a yearning to surrender himself or herself entirely to Him. In order to surrender ourselves thus, we must remain without doing or thinking anything, but simply being calmly and peacefully aware of the all-embracing presence of God. Since God is the infinite totality or fullness of being, and since He is therefore present within each one of us as our own essential being, I am, surrendering ourselves to Him is nothing other than surrendering ourselves entirely to being. In other words, it is just being submissively and firmly established in the state of deeply self-attentive and therefore thought-free being, which is the true state of Atma-vichara or self-investigation. Practicing this art of self-attentive being is also, therefore, the true state of practicing the presence of God. And for any mind that has developed the love to think of God constantly and one-pointedly, achieving this state of Atma-vichara or self-attentive being will be easy and natural. Therefore, though meditation upon a name or form of God is a mental activity and is therefore not in itself the state in which the mind has subsided in being, if practiced with true and heart-melting love, such meditation can be a great aid in leading our mind to the state of spiritual ripeness in which it will be genuinely willing to surrender itself entirely in the peaceful and all-consuming state of self-attentive being. Whereas the practice of pranayama or breath restraint will enable us to achieve merely a temporary state of mental subsidence, the practice of meditating with love upon a name or form of God will enable us to achieve the state of overwhelming love for God and consequent freedom from other desires, which is the state of mind that we require in order to be able to remain firmly established in our natural state of self-attentive being. However, just as the mental activity of meditating upon a name or form of God, if practiced with true love, becomes an aid that prepares our mind for the practice of self-investigation or self-attentive being, so pranayama, if practiced with the right attitude, can also become an aid that prepares our mind for the practice of self-investigation. What is that right attitude with which a person should practice pranayama? It is the understanding that achieving a sleep-like state of temporary subsidence of mind is not a worthwhile aim, because it cannot enable us to weaken our desires, and that a true spiritual benefit can be achieved by practicing pranayama only if, before allowing our mind to subside in such a sleep-like state of abeyance, we use the calmness of mind, brought about by pranayama, to withdraw our attention from our breath and to fix it instead on our simple self-conscious being. That is, as a means to calm our mind, which is usually agitated by many other thoughts. Pranayama can give us a relatively thought-free space in which we can practice the art of self-attentive being with a minimum of distraction. However, this aid that can potentially be provided by pranayama is truly unnecessary, because we can remain in the state of self-attentive being only if we have genuine love for it. And if we have genuine love for it, we will remain in it effortlessly, without the need for any external aid such as pranayama to calm our mind. Moreover, because the relatively thought-free space provided by pranayama is produced by an artificial means and not by a reduction in the strength of our desires, if we try to make use of that space by withdrawing our attention from our breath and fixing it instead upon our own self-conscious being, we are likely to experience a powerful urge to think of anything else as soon as we try to attend to our being. Therefore, if we really want to do something other than self-investigation, in the hope that it will eventually help us to practice self-investigation, trying to meditate with love upon a name or form of God is a much safer and more beneficial course to follow than pranayama. However, if we truly understand that God is always present within us as our own essential self-conscious being, why should we make effort to attend to anything else instead of simply trying our best to be constantly attentive to our own being? The other aid to self-investigation that Sri Ramana mentions in the 9th paragraph of Nanyar is Mita Sattvika Ahara Niyama. The term Ahara Niyama means food restraint, but since the Sanskrit word Ahara etymologically means procuring, fetching or taking, it can apply not only to the physical food that we take into our mouth, but also to the sensory food that we take into our mind through our 5 senses. Therefore, in order to keep our mind in a condition that is most favorable for us in our efforts to cultivate skill in the art of self-attentive being, we should, by every reasonable means, endeavor to ensure that both the physical food that we take into our body and the sensory food that we take into our mind are of a suitable quantity and quality. The quantity and quality of the food we should consume is described by Sri Ramana as mita and sattvika. The word mita refers to the quantity of food we should consume and means measured, limited, frugal, or moderate. The word sattvika refers to the quality of food we should consume and basically means pure and wholesome, or more precisely, endowed with the quality known as sattva, which literally means beingness, isness, essence, or reality, and which by extension means calmness, clarity, purity, wisdom, goodness, and virtue. The restriction or niyama of eating only sattvika food means abstaining from all types of non-sattvika food, which includes all meat, fish, and eggs, all intoxicants, such as alcohol and tobacco, and all other substances that excite passions or dull the clarity of our mind in any way. Though Hindus usually consider milk products to be sattvika, in most cases nowadays this is no longer the case, because the modern dairy industry is based upon the cruel and exploitative practices of factory farming. Even milk that is produced by less cruel means, such as organic farming, is not entirely untainted by cruelty, because it is obtained from cows that have been bred to produce unnatural and therefore basically unhealthy quantities of milk, and because the usual fate of dairy cows and their calves is to end their life by being slaughtered either for their meat, their leather, or both. Since one of the important principles underlying the observance of consuming only sattvika food is ahimsa, the compassionate principle of non-harming, or avoidance of causing suffering to any living being, any food whose production involves or is associated with the suffering of any human being or other creature must be considered as being not sattvika. In our present-day circumstances, therefore, the only food that can truly be considered as being sattvika is that which is organically produced, fairly traded, and above all, vegan. Besides the important and morally imperative principle of ahimsa, another important reason for taking care about the food we eat is that the effect that food has upon our mind is extremely subtle. If our food has been produced through the suffering of any creature, the subtle influence of that suffering will be contained in that food and will affect our mind. Similarly, if our food has been handled, processed, or cooked by a person with unhappy or negative thoughts in their mind, the subtle influence of such thoughts will be contained in that food. Therefore, it is generally recommended that a spiritual aspirant should, as far as possible, eat only food that is raw or that has been freshly cooked from raw or minimally processed ingredients by a person in a happy mood and with kind, caring, and loving thoughts in their mind, because kindness and love are the most important sattvika ingredients that can be added to food. With regard to the food that we take into our mind through our five senses, we should, as far as possible, avoid attending to any sense objects that excite passion, greed, lust, anger, envy, or any other such undesirable thoughts and emotions. Though we cannot always avoid being exposed to undesirable sights and sounds, we should try to keep such exposure to a minimum. Moreover, not only should we try to see and hear only sattvika sights and sounds, but we should also restrict the quantity of our sense perceptions to a mita or moderate level. In other words, we should avoid the habit of constantly bombarding our senses with unnecessary stimulation, which with all our modern technology is so abundantly available to us. What exactly does all this have to do with practicing the art of self-attentive being? In order for us to be able to remain steadily poised in the extremely subtle state of self-attentive being, it is essential that we restrain our desires and passions, reduce the quantity and vigor of our thoughts, and cultivate a contented, calm, and peaceful attitude of mind. Such desirelessness, contentment, calmness, and peace are qualities that in Sanskrit are described as sattva guna, or the quality of beingness, which is the original and natural quality of our essential consciousness, I am. Though this quality of sattva or beingness is the basic quality that always underlies the finite consciousness that we call our mind, our mental activity tends to cloud over and obscure it. Therefore, besides this basic quality of sattva, there are always two other qualities that function and compete in our mind, namely rajoguna, the dissipating quality of rajas, passion, emotion, restlessness, agitation and activity, and tamoguna, the obscuring quality of tamas, darkness, dullness, delusion, ignorance, insensitivity, heartlessness, cruelty, meanness, selfishness, pride, and baser emotions such as anger, greed, and lust. Whereas sattva is the natural quality of our essential being or sat, rajas and tamas are the respective qualities of the two basic aspects of our power of self-deception or maya, the former being the quality of our power of dissipation or vikshepa shakti, and the latter being the quality of our power of obscuration, or avarana shakti. Our mind is composed of a mixture of these three qualities, but in ever-varying proportions. So long as it exists, each of them will always be present in it to a greater or lesser degree, and throughout our waking and dream states they will be competing to dominate it. At any given time, one or more of them will predominate, and their relative predominance will influence our ability to be vigilantly attentive to our essential being, our consciousness I am. In order for us to be able to remain calmly and keenly attentive to our true but extremely subtle self-conscious being, the quality of sattva or beingness must predominate in our mind, overpowering and suppressing the other two qualities. So long as either or both of the other two qualities predominate, our mind will lack the clarity and calmness that is required for us to be able to remain keenly self-attentive. Sri Ramana used to illustrate this by means of two similes. Just as we would be unable to separate the extremely fine fibers of a silk cloth using a thick and heavy iron bar, so we will be unable to distinguish our extremely subtle being so long as our mind is under the sway of tamas, the dense and heavy quality of darkness, insensitivity, and pride. Likewise, just as we would be unable to find an extremely small object in the dark using a lamp that is flickering in a strong wind, so we will be unable to discern our extremely subtle and unmoving being so long as our mind is under the sway of rajas, the dissipating and distracting quality of passion and restless activity. Therefore, in order to be established firmly and steadily in our natural state of clear and unwavering self-attentive being, we should make every possible effort to cultivate and maintain a predominance of sattva in our mind. Since the quality of our mind is strongly influenced by the quality of the physical food we eat, Sri Ramana says that by consuming only moderate quantities of sattvika food, the sattva quality of our mind will increase, and this will help us in our practice of self-investigation. In order to cultivate this sattva quality, we should not just consume only sattvika food, but should also consume such food only in moderate quantities, because if we eat an excess quantity of even the most sattvika food, it will have a dulling effect upon our mind. Whereas we can dispense with most other aids, such as pranayama, murti dhyana, and mantra japa, observing this restriction on the quantity and quality of food that we consume is one aid with which we should, as far as possible, never dispense. Because whereas other aids distract our mind from our central aim of practicing the art of self-attentive being, this restriction on the nature and quantity of our food is no distraction and can only help us in our practice. If the art of self-attentive being were really difficult, we might require aids such as pranayama, murti dhyana, and mantra japa to help us to practice it. But it is in reality not at all difficult. In fact, it is the easiest thing of all. Because whereas all other efforts that we make are unnatural to us, self-attentive being is our natural state, and truly requires no effort at all. Effort appears to be necessary only because we have a greater liking to attend to other things than to abide attentively in our own being. Our desire for an attachment to things other than ourself makes us unwilling to let go of everything and remain calm, unattached and unwavering in our thought-free natural state of self-attentive being, and our unwillingness to remain thus makes it appear difficult. However, in itself, abiding in this true state of self-attentive being is not at all difficult. Therefore, in the refrain and sub-refrain that he composed for his song, Atma Vidya, Sri Ramana sings, "What a wonder Atma Vidya, the science and art of self-knowledge, is so extremely easy. What a wonder so extremely easy. Our true self is so very real even to ordinary unlearned people that in comparison even a malaka fruit in our palm ends the paling into significance as unreal." The Sanskrit word vidya basically means knowledge, but in actual usage it has a broad range of meanings including philosophy, science, art, learning, or any practical skill. Thus, the compound word Atma Vidya, which in Tamil is generally modified as Anma Vidyai, means the practical science and art of knowing our own real self or essential being. Our consciousness of our own being, I am, which is our true self, is our first and most basic knowledge, and hence it is clearly real to us at all times, even before we learn or understand anything else. As real as an amlaka fruit in the hand is an idiomatic way of saying that something is perfectly clear and obvious. But in comparison to our absolutely clear and real consciousness I am, even the clarity and reality of such a fruit in our hand pales into complete insignificance. When our true self or essential being I am is so very real to each one of us, the science and art of knowing and being ourself is extremely easy, far easier than any other thing imaginable. In order to know our own real self, we need not do anything. Because we ourself are the reality that we call ourself or Atman, we cannot know ourself as an object. We know objects by an act of knowing, that is, by paying attention to them. This act of paying attention to an object is a movement of our attention away from ourself toward that object, which we imagine to be other than ourself. Because the process of knowing anything other than ourself involves this stirring of our attention, arousing it from its natural state of reposing as our simple, non-dual consciousness of being, and directing it outwards to something that seems to be other than ourself. It is an action or doing. However, we cannot know ourself in this same manner, because any movement or action of our attention takes it away from ourself. Therefore, we cannot know ourself by an act of knowing or by any other kind of doing. Because our real self is perfectly clear self-conscious being, we can know it only by being it, and not by doing anything, by merely being self-attentive. We remain naturally as our own self-conscious being without doing anything. Therefore, since this art of self-attentive being does not involve even the least action of our mind, speech, or body, it is the easiest means, and in fact the only true adequate means, for us to experience the infinite happiness of true self-knowledge. Hence in verse 4 of Anma Vidai, Sri Ramana sings, to untie the bonds beginning with karma, that is the bonds of action and of all that results from action, and to rise above or revive it from the ruin beginning with birth, that is, to transcend and become free from the miseries of embodied existence, which begins with birth and ends with death, only to begin once again with birth in another mind-created body. Rather than any other path, this path of simple self-attentive being is exceedingly easy. When we just are, having settled calmly and peacefully, in perfect repose as our simple self-conscious being, without even the least karma action of mind, speech, or body, in our heart, the innermost core of our being, the light of self will shine forth clearly as our non-dual consciousness of being. I am I. Having thereby drowned and lost our individual self in this perfectly peaceful and infinitely clear state of true self-knowledge, we will discover it to be our eternal experience. Fear will not exist. The ocean of infinite bliss alone will remain. To attain this eternal experience of infinite happiness, we need not do anything by mind, speech, or body, but must merely subside and settle calmly in our natural state of perfectly clear self-conscious being. The words that Sri Ramana uses here to describe this state of just being are summa amarndu irukka. The word irukka is the infinitive form of the verbal root iru, meaning be, and is used idiomatically in the sense when we are. The word amarndu is the past principle of the verb amartal, which means to abide, remain, be seated, become still, become calm, become tranquil, rest, settle down, or be extinguished. The adverb summa means just merely leisurely, silently, quietly, calmly, motionlessly, inactively, without doing anything, or in perfect peace and repose. Since summa can be taken as qualifying both amarndu and irukka, the clause summa amarndu irukka means when we just are, having settled silently, calmly, and peacefully in perfect repose. The sense of these three words, especially the word summa, is further emphasized by the preceding words, which mean without even the least action of mind, speech, or body. Therefore, the practice of Atma Vidya, the science and art of knowing our own real self, is just being, without even the least action of mind, speech, or body. Our mind having subsided and settled peacefully in and as our simple self-conscious being. The practice of just being, or summa irupadu, is also clearly explained by Sri Ramana in the 6th paragraph of Nanyar, where he defines it as making our mind to subside, settle down, melt, dissolve, disappear, be absorbed, or perish in Atma Svarupa, our own essential self. Therefore, since this practice of Atma Vidya is just being our own ever self-conscious being, and since it does not involve any action of our mind, speech, or body, it is indeed exceedingly easy, far easier than any other path or form of spiritual practice. Nevertheless, due to the density of our self-imposed delusion or maya, and due to the strength of our resulting desires, knowing and being our real self appears, in the view of our mind, to be difficult. That is, though the state of absolutely clear, self-conscious being is truly our natural state, though it is always experienced by us as I am, its natural clarity appears to our mind to be clouded and obscured by thoughts which are impelled by our deeply rooted desires, and hence discerning it clearly in the midst of all these thoughts seems to our mind to be difficult. This seeming difficulty will persist so long as our mind is under the sway of Maya and its gunas or qualities, tamas and rajas. As we saw earlier, trying to focus our attention on our essential consciousness of being, when our mind is under the sway of tamoguna, the obscuring quality of darkness and insensitivity, is like attempting to separate the fine threads of a silk cloth with the blunt end of a heavy iron bar. And trying to do so when our mind is under the sway of rajoguna, the dissipating quality of restlessness and agitation, is like attempting to find a tiny object in the dark with the aid of the flickering light of a lantern buffeted by a strong wind. Hence, for those of us whose self-delusion and desires are strong, and in whose mind these two gunas therefore predominate, calmly attending to and abiding as our own essential consciousness of being will appear to be not easy. However, just as the only way to learn to talk is to talk, the only way to learn to walk is to walk, and the only way to learn to read is to read, the only way to learn the art of attending to and abiding as our own pure self-conscious being is to practice this art. However many times our attempts fail, we should persevere in trying again and again. As we do so, we will gradually but steadily gain the skill required to abide firmly as our own real self, our true and essential consciousness of being I am. Self-abidance, which is the art of self-attentive being, is not impossible for anyone. All that is needed is persistent effort. Every moment that we are attentive to our natural consciousness of our own being, I am, however clumsily and imperfectly, the clear light of such relatively unadulterated self-consciousness will be cleansing and purifying our mind, dispersing the darkness of tamoguna and calming the agitation of rajoguna, and thereby allowing the natural clarity of sattva guna or beingness to manifest itself. To express the same truth in another way, when we practice the art of self-attentive being, the clarity of our self-attentiveness acts like the scorching rays of the sun, drying up all the seeds of desire in our heart and thereby rendering them infertile. Though the destruction of these seeds of our desires is the ultimate aim and purpose of all forms of spiritual practice, they can in fact be effectively destroyed, scorched, and rendered infertile only by the clarity of our self-attentive beingness and by no other means. These seeds of our desires, which in Vedanta philosophy are named as vasanas, a word that is usually translated as latent mental tendencies or inclinations, but whose actual sense can be better translated as latent mental impulsions or driving forces are what rise and manifest in our mind as thoughts. Since their very existence is threatened by the clarity of our self-abidance or self-attentive beingness, when we try to practice abiding in this state of self-attentive being, they rise in rebellion, manifesting in our mind as innumerable thoughts of various kinds. When they rebel against our self-attentive beingness in this manner, the only way to vanquish them is to ignore them by keeping our attention firmly fixed upon our own essential being, as explained by Sri Ramana in the following passage from the 6th paragraph of Nanyar. If other thoughts rise, without trying to complete them, we must investigate to whom they have occurred. However many thoughts rise, what does it matter? As soon as each thought appears, if we vigilantly investigate to whom it has occurred, to me will be clear. That is, we will be clearly reminded of ourself, to whom each thought occurs. If we thus investigate who am I, that is, if we turn our attention back towards ourself and keep it firmly fixed and vigilantly upon our own essential self-conscious being in order to discover what this me really is, our mind will return to its birthplace, the innermost core of our being, which is the source from which it arose, and since we thereby refrain from attending to it, the thought which had risen will also subside. When we practice and practice in this manner, to our mind the power to stand firmly established in its birthplace will increase. No thought can rise without us to think it. Therefore, the easy way for us to divert our attention away from each thought as and when it rises is to remember that it has occurred only to ourselves. Instead of allowing ourselves to be distracted by any thought that arises, if we vigilantly continue to remember only ourself, each of our thoughts will perish as soon as it attempts to rise, because without our attention it cannot survive. If, however, we do become momentarily distracted by any thought, we should immediately divert our attention away from it towards ourself by remembering that it has occurred only to me. As soon as we remember this me to whom that thought has occurred, our attention will return to its source, which is our own self-consciousness of being I am. This process of drawing our attention back towards our own self-conscious being by keenly scrutinizing ourselves in an attempt to discover who am I to whom these thoughts have occurred is what Sri Ramana describes when he says, if we investigate who am I, our mind will return to its birthplace. Our mind is our power of attention, which becomes extroverted by thinking of things other than ourselves, and its birthplace or source is our own being, our basic and essential self-consciousness I am. Therefore, when we divert our mind away from all thoughts and focus it exclusively in our being, we are simply returning it to its own birthplace, the source from which it had arisen. Our mind rises only by imagining things other than itself, and those imagined things are its thoughts. Therefore, when we turn our mind or attention towards our own essential being, it is diverted away from all its imaginary thoughts, and hence it subsides in its source and remains as mere self-conscious being. When we thus remain as being instead of rising as our thinking mind, our thoughts are all deprived of our attention, and since no thought can exist unless we pay attention to it, Sri Ramana adds that when our mind thus subsides in its birthplace or source, the thought which had risen will also subside. He then concludes by saying, when we practice and practice in this manner, to our mind the power to stand firmly established in its birthplace will increase. That is, when we repeatedly practice this art of immediately turning our attention back towards its source, whenever it is distracted even to the slightest extent by the rising of any thought, the ability of our mind to remain firmly and self-attentively established as mere being will increase. Therefore, repeated and persistent practice of this art of self-attentive being is the only means by which we can cultivate the ability and strength to remain unshaken by thoughts, and thereby to weaken and eventually destroy all our vasanas, the seeds of our desires which give rise to them. This process of gradually fixing our mind or attention more and more firmly in our own essential self-conscious being by repeatedly and persistently withdrawing it from all thoughts of any other than ourself, is clearly described by Sri Krishna in two extremely important verses of the Bhagavad Gita, verses 25 and 26 of chapter 6, which Sri Ramana has translated into Tamil as verses 27 and 28 of Bhagavad Gita Saram, a selection that he made of 42 verses from the Bhagavad Gita that expresses its sara, or essence. By an intellect, a power of discrimination or discernment, imbued with firmness, steadfastness, resolution, persistence, or courage, one should gently and gradually withdraw one's mind from all activity. Having made one's mind stand firm in Atman, one's own real self or essential being, one should not think even a little of anything whatsoever. Wherever the ever-wavering and unsteady mind goes, restraining or withdrawing it from there, one should subdue it by always keeping it firmly fixed, only in Atman, one's own real self. The key words used here are Atma Samstam Mana Kritva, which literally mean having made the mind stand firm or still in self, and by clear implication, they should be applied to each of the three sentences in these two verses. That is, we should gently and gradually withdraw our mind from all activity or thinking by making it stand firmly and motionless in our essential self. Having thus made it stand firm and motionless in our essential self, we should refrain from thinking of anything whatsoever. And if due to our lack of vigilance, it again wanders towards anything else, by making it stand firm once again in our essential self, we should restrain its wanderings, withdrawing it from whatever it is thinking of, and thereby subduing it and making it subside in our essential self. What exactly does Sri Krishna mean when he says that we should make our mind stand firm in self or Atman? The word samsta is the word sta, which literally means standing, qualified by the prefix sam, which literally means with or together with, but which is used to express not only conjunction or union, but also intensity, completeness, or thoroughness. Thus, samscha means standing with, standing united with, standing firm, standing still, standing fixed, or simply firmly abiding, remaining or being. Hence the words Atma Samsta Mana denotes the state in which our mind is firmly and motionlessly established in our essential being as our essential being, having consciously subsided and thereby merged, united, and become one with it. Therefore, what Sri Krishna clearly implies by these words is that we should keep our entire mind or attention firmly fixed or keenly focused upon our real self or essential being, and should thereby remain firmly in the state of our clear self-attentive being.